Greetings, I'm Shad, and it is time for me to share my thoughts on the classic knight vs samurai debate. Now, there are a lot of opinions and feelings out there regarding this question. Who would win, the knight or the samurai? Some feel that it is a pointless, and some even go further than that and feel it's an insulting question to ask. For myself, I just think it's a fun, nerdy question. It's like, who would win, the Hulk or Superman? And this is kind of the same thing, who would win, knight versus samurai? So I don't think there's any harm in wondering about this question, but of course, the way we go about doing it can lead to misconceptions. When people say, no, the knight would win because they're all better, or the samurai win because they're all better, those kind of conclusions and statements can lead to some big misconceptions. And the statements that say, it's a pointless question does have some grounds in the sense that either side could win depending on the skill of the warrior. You had very skilled knights, you had very skilled samurai, and you had less skilled on both sides as well. And in extension to that, you could have a peasant fighting a knight or a samurai, and if he just got lucky, he could win, or if he was particularly strong or skillful in the quarterstaff or whatever, he has a chance of winning too, if he was just that good, and say he was fighting less skilled opponents. So in the end, skill is going to be the primary factor. Having said that, I don't feel understanding this context renders the fun question of knight versus samurai completely redundant, because then what if both opponents were perfectly equal in skill? Now that actually changes the question, because that makes it not necessarily knight versus samurai. What it is really asking is who has the better equipment to give them more advantage over the opponent. Because if you had two equally skilled opponents, you would rightly then think that the next determining factor in who would win then would be who has the advantage in arms. So it really comes down to a question of who had the better technology. Well, something that does need to be understood about this question, and sometimes it's something that I feel is misunderstood quite a bit, is how little effect a slight difference in arms can actually make in combat. Skill is by far, and even luck, skill and luck is by far the larger determining factor in who would win a fight over who has an advantage in arms. Of course, there are big differences, say, like if you have a massive reach advantage over the opponent, that can make a big difference. But when I'm talking about, like, slight differences in armor, when the armor is mostly comparable and one is only slightly better than the other, and the weapons are equally sized, made differently, but therefore will perform differently under different stresses and everything like that, those things will have very, very little effect in the long run. In fact, one might say that there is such little effect in that trying to measure and then apply them to find the difference and effect in combat is negligible. So little that there's really no point in looking at it. And on the note of having a large disparity in the arms of opponents, say an opponent has a huge reach advantage, well, even then, okay, skill and luck can easily outweigh that advantage. There's always a way to beat it. Like, a guy who only has a sword can very much defeat a guy in full plate armor, okay? It would be more difficult, but with skill and luck, it can be done, especially if there is a large difference in skill. Now, since I'm going to be sharing a very definitive opinion on who had the better technology, and honestly I think it is kind of obvious, though it can be brought up to massive contention as well, so maybe it's not as obvious as I think it is. But because we're going into that technology level, another point of context needs to be mentioned, and that is not everyone had the same quality of equipment, okay? If you look at in Europe, you had really, really excellently made swords, and then you had a huge gamut of crap swords, and so dependent on what level of quality will affect this question. And that's the same with the samurai, because not all katanas were equal. Some were not even folded, they were just beaten out of a lump of steel. And so in my analysis, I am going to be considering the best compared to the best. The best European arms and weapons compared to the best Japanese samurai arms and weapons. And like I said, I kind of feel it is obvious, especially when you look at the real kind of quality that existed in the two historical periods, The knights in Europe had better armor and weapons over the samurai. Their armor technology was more advanced, it covered more of the body, it was just as articulated in my opinion. They had far better smelting technology to get rid of more impurities in the steel, which resulted in higher quality steel. And they also knew how to make hardened spring steel, which is, in my opinion, way better than the types of differential hardening that you have in samurai swords. Now, like I said before, spring steel versus a differentially hardened steel sword, the difference in combat really isn't going to be huge. Like that, the types of steel only comes into big importance when the sword gets put under massive stress, and that would only happen if you're using your sword incorrectly, and it would be more uncommon than common. In the general uses of swords, as long as the sword is strong enough and serviceable, it will do the job, and the difference in steel isn't actually going to make a big difference. But in Europe, they had more weapon and armor evolution and innovation, which produced a wider variety of weapons. They had more weapons that were focused and designed to combat armor specifically, where the samurai do not. Because look at the mace, the war hammer, the poleaxe. And so, if all things were equal, both combatant, knight and samurai, were of equal skill, and they had equal amounts of luck on their side, and it really came down to who had the advantage in their arms and weapons, yes, definitely the knight, absolutely. Now, if anyone is going to say, oh, it's not fair to consider both opponents as equal skill because the samurai have martial arts and they were just generally more skilled than the knights, bullcrap, okay? No, absolute bullcrap, get that out of your head. There was easily as effective and comparable martial arts in Europe as there was in Japan when it comes to swordplay and general combat techniques, and they were easily as sophisticated as one another. Now, if you really, really don't like me saying that, for instance, European swords, when you consider the best made European swords in the same kind of time periods compared to Europe and Japan, or looking at the 15th, 16th century, if you really don't like me saying that European swords were made out of better steel and were better quality than a traditionally made katana, I really suggest you watch my video series, The Truth About the Katana, because I systematically break down, point by point, how katanas are made and what effect that would cause in their use. And so I'm not just blowing wind out of my rear end when I say that. I'm actually coming to it with, I would like to consider, a fairly informed opinion on the subject. Now, in sharing my opinions in regarding knights versus samurai, does that mean I think knights are universally better than samurais? No, I don't. And I don't think samurais are universally better than knights, because like I said, the larger thing that will affect the outcome of a fight would be skill and luck. And so with that in mind, I think that knights and samurais equally have as much of a chance over the other as beating one another. And if you were to try and say who would win in an all-out war, well, that's actually something very different. That's a different question, because then we would need to look at war tactics, how the different cultures handled sieges and skirmishes, and how they, did battlefield tactics and everything like that. Completely different question. So this wasn't a question of who would win in an all-out war, it was who would win in a one-on-one fight. Now, the question of knight versus samurai is kind of I feel it is the most fun and interesting warrior culture comparison that can be made, because they're the most equivalent kind of warrior cultures that existed in history. If you look at other warrior cultures, like, say, and I should really say perhaps other warrior professions, because saying warrior culture can be misleading, like Viking. Viking wasn't a warrior culture, that was more of a profession. But still, if you look at the Vikings and also can throw into the mix the Spartans and such, who would win? Knight versus Viking versus Spartan versus Samurai and all that, stuff. Knight and Samurai, in my opinion, will come out on top above all others because of armor is a big reason, and overall better technology. And if you want another little factor as to why Knights and Samurais would come out mostly on top of nearly all other warrior culture, traditions, professions, and such like that, cavalry, okay? Knights and samurais used horses. Why? Well, because they are warrior cultures, traditions, whatever, that existed a bit later on in history and had better technology and employed cavalry in a larger extent. And Vikings didn't use cavalry, okay? And so Vikings and Spartans, because they are at a massive disadvantage in arms, and they don't have cavalry, big thing there, they'd be totally screwed if they ever face each other on the battlefield. But that is again kind of looking at a war, a battlefield comparison. And one-on-one, it's a bit different, but still better arms and technology will make knights and samurais come out on top above other warrior culture and traditions. So there you go, that is Shad's opinions and thoughts on the classic debate of knights versus samurai. Thank you for watching, and until next time, farewell.